serve in this position. So anyway, they do a great job, and they're here faithfully. So thank you so much. This morning I sent out an email to some book club members and garden club members, and I said we had an historian of local renown, I believe, who would be doing our book review today, and that I was sure they would not want to miss it. And I know I am so thrilled to be here. And our reviewer is Dr. Frances Blakely Williams, and she was born and grew up in Grenada. She graduated from John Rundle High School. She has an Associate of Arts degree from Wood Junior College. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Social Studies from Mississippi State. She has a Master of Social Studies Education from Mississippi State, and she has a Doctorate of Education from the University of Mississippi. She was a Social Studies teacher, instructor for Tupelo High School, and where she taught American history, world history, and AP European history. And she has also been adjunct instructor at Blue Mountain College, Lee-Itawamba Community College, and the University of Mississippi. She has a lovely family. Her husband is Philip Williams. Her son is Blakely Williams. Her daughter-in-law is Amy Williams. Her granddaughter is Riley Blakely Williams. And her father is Carruthers Blakely. Frances, I'm really looking forward to this. And as I've told some of you, we may have a test after she gets through. So thank you.
Well, goodness, I hope I can live up to all those expectations. I'm reviewing today Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, and the review grew out of a discussion that Margaret and I had about the 100th anniversary of World War I. World War I started in 1914. It ended in 1918, and she and I were talking about it. She said, we need to have a review about it, and I said, well, the Treaty of Paris at the end of the war was 1919. We don't have much time left. So we decided that this would be a good opportunity, and of course it's interesting that the book is The Guns of August, and it's August, but it's unfortunate, I think, that the United States forgets how horrendous World War I was. World War II came along and more or less swept away our real horrors with World War I. And we need to be reminded of those men every once in a while. I'm sure you have some in your family. My husband's grandfather was trained as a machine gunner for World War I and was lucky enough for his arrival to be after the armistice. His grandmother had a brother who died from swine flu in training camp at the age of 21. Swine flu swept the world during that period of time, and as many people died from swine flu as from actually being killed in the war. Russia lost 2 million men, Germany about 2 million almost, France nearly 1.5 million, Austria-Hungary 1.25 million, Britain almost 1 million, and the United States, because of our late entry into the war, we were in the war from April of 1917 till November of 1918, we lost 115,000. And maybe that accounts for some of our lack of attention to World War I. I don't know. We don't remember dates very well. I watch the news pretty regularly. I did not see any mention at all on August the 6th of Hiroshima Day. Did any of you? And that event literally changed the world forever. Not just the United States, but changed the world forever. I have a friend who gets a magazine from Britain, and she's kind enough to share it with me. It always has a lot of information about the royals. And I thought this was interesting. I cut this out. It was April the 25th, Anzac Day. the anniversary of the first major military action fought by Australian and New Zealand forces during the First World War, when they set out to capture Gallipoli. And they had to fight the Turks because the Turks were fighting on the side of the Germans in World War I. There was a memorial service in Westminster Abbey attended by the royals. William was not there because he was in New Zealand because of that bombing. Do you remember back in the spring? He was there for that. But I thought this was very moving. Turkey's government has changed. Their government is the most westernized of all of the Muslim nations, really. And this is what the Turkish minister said. His name was Ümit Yaklin, read the words that are inscribed on the memorial in Anzac Cove on Gallipoli. And they were written by the founder of modern Turkey. They called him Ataturk, the father of Turkey. And he is the one who really modernized the country. The inscription begins, "Those heroes that shared their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace." And I thought that was very moving. But to imagine now, World War I, and they are having a memorial service in Westminster Abbey. How many of us even thought about it? You know, certainly not anybody, I think, in our news media. Now, Barbara Tuchman wrote this in 1962, and she won the Pulitzer Prize. But this is the book. If you want to know almost minute by minute what happened as far as the events leading up to World War I, this is the book. And it's very detailed, and I took a little license. I put some things in here that I knew about rulers that I thought made it a little more interesting and understandable. But the basics all come from her book. Now, when Edward VII died in May of 1910, his funeral was attended by 9 kings, 5 heirs apparent, 7 queens, 40 or more imperial or royal highnesses. Together they represented 70 nations in the greatest assemblage of royalty and rank ever gathered in one place. And that included countries like Siam and China and Egypt and Persia, not just Europe. Also, this was the last meeting of its kind. We sent former President Teddy Roosevelt. He was our representative. By 1918, the year that World War I ended, most of these rulers would have lost their thrones and the old order of rank, wealth, and privilege had ended. So, in a sense, World War I is the beginning of the modern era in great in the movement toward the modern period. World War I is the beginning. Now, due to his mother, Queen Victoria, who was called the grandmother of Europe because she married all of her 9 children into the royal houses of Europe, Edward was called the uncle of Europe. And he was the uncle of Kaiser William, and Kaiser and Tsar are words that simply mean Caesar. He was the uncle of Kaiser William of Germany, and William was the son of Edward's older sister. Through his wife, Queen Alexandra, sister, who was the dowager Empress Marie of Russia, Edward was the uncle to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who was married to Edward's own niece, Alex, who was, of course, the Tsarina. Edward's daughter, Maud, was the Queen of Norway. Another niece, Ina, was the Queen of Spain, and a third niece, Marie, was soon to be the Queen of Romania. His wife, Queen Alexandra's family, occupied the throne of Denmark and supplied kings to Greece and Norway. All of the royal houses of Europe were interrelated. So World War I is not just a fight between countries, it is a family squabble, so to speak, on a grand nature. And sometimes we don't always remember that. Now, Edward, in his lifetime, was known as the Playboy Prince. He loved the high life. He loved theater and balls and shooting parties at English country houses and fine food and wine and beautiful women. And I'm sure some of you watched Downton Abbey. You might remember Maggie Smith's character at one point they were talking about some kind of little scandalous episode in her early youth, and she made the comment, well, after all, we were the Edwardians, as if that explained the whole thing, you know. Excess was a part of that aristocratic lifestyle. Now, he ruled only 9 years, but during that period of time, he did something that was very important. History is giving him credit now more than they did shortly after his death. He renewed relations between Britain and France. Britain and France had been at war since William the Conqueror, and the situation with Napoleon didn't help. So they really weren't friends until World War I, politically, and he had a great deal to do with that. The reason he ruled 9 years is because his mother, Victoria, actually ruled her time and his too. She ruled up until her day. She was the longest reigning monarch in British history. She became queen at the age of 18 in 1837, and she ruled till 1901. Now, the longest reigning monarch today is our present queen, Queen Elizabeth, who became queen at the age of 25 in 1952. Victoria ruled 64 years, and Elizabeth has ruled 67. So that's the record. And Prince Charles is the longest serving Prince of Wales in history. Now, after the funeral, Lord Esher, who was the chairman of the War Committee, wrote in his diary this statement: "There was never such a breakup. All the old buoys which have marked the channel of our lives seem to have been swept away." And that was so true, especially among the aristocratic class. Now, Kaiser William of Germany was the son of Queen Victoria's oldest child, who was also named Victoria. Her family called her Vicky. And she had made an arranged marriage with Frederick, who was the son of the King of Prussia, William I of Prussia. But it was a love match. And unfortunately, when William I died, Frederick was suffering from throat cancer, and he ruled only a very few months. And I've often thought, if one person's life could have made a difference in history, Victoria, his wife, came from a representative government, Britain, and he listened to her. He was influenced to an extent by her. I've often wondered if he had lived longer, that he might have moved Germany toward a representative government, and possibly we wouldn't have had World War I or World War II. Can you imagine the world without those two wars in the 20th century? But unfortunately for the world, he died. And his son, William II, became Kaiser, and he essentially followed his grandfather because his father died so quickly. Now, when he inherited from his grandfather, he inherited a united Germany. Germany had been a patchwork of little states for many, many years, and Prussia emerged as one of the most powerful. And William of Prussia had a chancellor named Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. He was a perfect Machiavellian. His goal was to unify all the German states under the rule of William I. He was very loyal to William. And he did this by deliberately engineering 3 wars. Now, I've studied history long enough to know when wars happen, all of them are not necessary. And the first he engineered was with Denmark, and Queen Alexandra, who was from Denmark, Queen Alexandra of Britain, never forgave him for that. Second, it was with Austria to break Austria's power in Europe. And finally, to unite the northern German Protestants and the southern German Catholics, he gave them an old enemy to hate, France. They had been enemies with France for generations. And in order to do this, William had allowed Bismarck to build up a huge army. The Prussian army became the best in Europe. And Bismarck made the Hohenzollern family, which was William's family, the rulers of a united Germany. The capital, Berlin, today in Germany, was the capital of Brandenburg, which was the original area that the Hohenzollerns controlled. It became Brandenburg, Prussia, and you might remember that the Brandenburg Gate is still in Berlin today with that name. Even Napoleon recognized in his day when he fought Prussia that Prussia was built on a militaristic background. And he made the statement, Prussia was hatched from a cannonball. And I thought that was a pretty astute observation. Now, the last of Bismarck's three wars, as I told you, was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. And it brought down the Second French Empire of Napoleon III. Napoleon III, the Second Empire, he was Napoleon's nephew. Napoleon had the First French Empire. His nephew, Napoleon III, had the Second. In case you're wondering about the Third, Napoleon had a son who died, who never reigned, but he still got the number. So the nephew is the Third. During this war, Prussia treated France very brutally. Paris was besieged. The Parisians starved, very much like the people in Vicksburg did in the Civil War. They starved, and they were so determined that Germany would never do anything to bring that about again. They used the racetrack in Paris to herd sheep and cattle in case when the war started that they would be besieged. They were that frightened of it. But when the First Battle of the Marne took place, the First Battle of World War I, the battle cry that the French soldiers were shouting as they went into battle was revanche, revenge for the Franco-Prussian War. And a great deal played out. The Treaty of Paris, that this humiliating treaty that the Germans had forced on the French at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, was hammered out in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, the greatest palace of the greatest French king. It was done deliberately to humiliate the French. And a lot of people think the Treaty of Paris of 1919 laid the seeds for World War II because of the harsh treatment of Germany. A lot of that was due, it was payback for what Germany had done to France in the Franco-Prussian War. It's not an accident the Treaty of Paris that ended World War I was negotiated in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. It's not an accident that Germany was required to pay a huge amount of money as a war indemnity. In other words, you lost, you pay. They had made the French in the Franco-Prussian War pay, I think it was $1 billion francs indemnity. They had tried to weaken France for a generation, and France surprised them by being prosperous enough to pay it off very quickly. And there was something about the Germans, they always envied the French. In Germany, if you wanted to say someone was extremely wealthy, the statement was, he is rich as God in France. You know. So that animosity always was there. Now, when a war begins, there are usually underlying causes that are in place that make it possible for one dramatic, cataclysmic event to start the war. And that was the case in World War I. There were several underlying causes. One of these is nationalism. Now, nationalism is a feeling of loyalty to one's country. It can be a good thing. It's tied up with patriotism. Every country needs a measure of nationalism. The definition is interesting from our viewpoint, the American viewpoint. It's the definition, a feeling among a group of people bound by ties of common culture, common history, and common language. And when you think that our country was formed of groups of people who came over here and had no common culture, no common religion, no common history, and no common language, we are remarkable in the history of the world. We just really kind of take it for granted, but it is remarkable in the history of the world. Now, as I said, nationalism is a good thing in moderation, like most things are, but extreme nationalism is very harmful, and it becomes something called chauvinism, which was named for a French soldier who was a fanatic during Napoleon's war. And chauvinism means nationalism to the point that a person thinks his or her country is superior simply because it's that country. And Hitler would magnify that in World War II. If you remember, he believed that the Germans were the super race, and that is the extreme of chauvinism. That is not good. The area of Europe that was the most nationalistic at this time was the Balkan Peninsula. It was the hot spot for nationalism. The Balkan Peninsula was made up of a patchwork of little tiny countries. They were all ethnic groups, all nationalities, all languages. They had several religions, particularly the Muslim faith and the Christian faith. And the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, had control of them. But the Turkish Empire was weakening, and all these little countries wanted their independence. When the Turkish Empire weakened, Austria-Hungary moved south and absorbed a number of those Balkan countries. And it is because of nationalism, and it's not, we can understand why the term for the Balkan Peninsula was the powder keg of Europe. Now, it's interesting, too, in American history, our present First Lady is only the second First Lady to have not been born in the United States. John Quincy Adams' wife was born in England. But it's interesting also to think that our First Lady is the only First Lady to have been born in a communist country. I think the little country she lives in now. Remember what happened, nationalism, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989? They all became independent countries again. And I think the one she's from is called Slovenia now. But some historians say the map of Europe looks more now like it did before World War I. Slovenia was a part of Yugoslavia, which was created in the Treaty of Paris of 1919. So we're back to, what is it? The more things change, the more they stay the same. This, to some extent there. Now, another underlying cause was imperialism. There was a huge race in the 1800s because of the developing industrialism in Europe. Every major European country that was becoming industrialized wanted raw materials to feed the factories. And they looked to underdeveloped nations, particularly Africa and Asia. And they simply went in with their superior firepower and took them and colonized those areas. And that laid the groundwork for resentment. Germany, for example, thought that Britain and France got the prime pieces of Africa. And Germany didn't get much of Africa. And those things, resentment smoldered. Now, if you're wondering why Central and South America did not become prime territory for colonization, it's because in 1820, under James Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine was issued. And the Monroe Doctrine simply stated, and I'm just giving the basics, and it was not terribly lengthy, but this is the basics. The Western Hemisphere is closed to colonization. Any country in Europe that intends to take some part of South America, Central America, any part of the Western Hemisphere will have to deal with the United States. And none of those countries had been willing to do that. So that closed the door on colonization in the Western Hemisphere. Now, we all remember, most of us in here remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when John Kennedy told Cuba, which was a foreign country, to get the Russian missiles out of Cuba. We told a foreign country what it had to do. That was an enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine, and they got them out. And you remember, we came very close to World War III. Now, interestingly enough, imperialism, yes, was one of the reasons America entered the war. When the war was going on, Zimmerman was the German ambassador, and he sent a message to Mexico and promised Mexico, if Mexico would go to war with the United States in the midst of World War I to keep us out of the war, they knew we probably were going to come in, that Germany, after it had defeated and conquered the countries in Europe, would see that Mexico got everything that the United States had taken from Mexico restored, which would have been the whole southwestern quarter of the United States plus Texas. And that is one of the major reasons we went to war. That and continued attacks on ships by submarines. I was watching British Antiques Roadshow, and a man showed up one morning. I don't know if y'all ever watched that, but I think it's fascinating. A man showed up one morning with the Zimmerman note. His great-grandfather or uncle or somebody in the family had transcribed it and had taken, he said, my grandfather took it to his commanding officer and said, do you want America to enter the war? And they said, yes. Sent the Zimmerman note to Washington. But I never thought that I would actually see on television the note. You know, there was a telegram. Another underlying cause was militarism. In this period of the 1800s, all the major industrialized countries were building up enormous armies and navies. And the danger of that is with a huge army and navy, a country often is tempted to use military might to solve problems rather than diplomacy. So, in other words, all of these massive armies were just waiting for something to happen. And the final underlying cause is a system of alliances. Bismarck was brilliant, and he understood diplomacy and tactics very, very well. He created the Triple Alliance, which was made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And Austria-Hungary is a German-speaking country. It has a Germanic background. So that was a natural match, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Each of them, of course, pledged if one of them was attacked to come to the aid of all of them. And the purpose was to isolate France. Bismarck was smart enough to try to keep friendly relations with Britain and Russia. Because if you look at the map of Europe, he knew if Germany got into a two-front war with France on one side and Russia on the other, he would have to split his forces, and the chances of their winning would diminish dramatically, which is exactly what happened in both wars. Both wars. Now, we fought a two-front war in World War II. We fought in Europe, and we fought in the Pacific. But we were fortunate enough to have oceans on either side of us, you know. But those are not easy to win. Now, Bismarck, as I said, he was a very wise man. He literally engineered the rise of modern Germany, the unification. But when Kaiser William came to the throne, you have to understand a little about his background. He had a birth injury, and as a result of a birth injury, his left arm did not develop fully. And he was in a militaristic type of environment like he grew up in. That was something he was very concerned about. He developed into being a bully. He was a braggart. He always knew more than everybody else about what was best for Germany. And when he came to the throne, he immediately dismissed Bismarck. And there's a famous cartoon of Bismarck, the old man, walking down the steps of the ship of state, and the young, smirking William II standing on the bow, looking down at him go down. And in a sense, that was the beginning of the end to a great extent. His mother had trouble loving him, William II. Now, immediately, William began to try to build a strong navy and a strong army, even bigger. He wanted a colonial empire. He always thought Germany was not being treated fairly. It didn't get its due. Germany deserved its place in the sun, he would say. Naturally, when he began doing this, France, who was alarmed, began to seek out Russia. And Russia needed a loan at the time, and France gave him a loan. And as a result, we end with another alliance, Britain, France, and Russia. So at this point, Barbara Tuchman writes, to describe the situation, Europe was a heap of swords piled as delicately as jackstraws. One could not be pulled out without moving the others. And that is exactly, of course, what happened. Now, the Empire of Austria-Hungary was ruled by Francis Joseph, and he became ruler in 1849 as a result of a revolution, but by this time he was in his 80s. He was the eldest of all of the rulers of Europe. And if his life had been put in a novel, it wouldn't have sold because nobody'd believe it. It was just totally unbelievable. But it really happened. He experienced so much personal tragedy. He had a beautiful, very unstable wife named Elizabeth, and they were estranged. She traveled throughout Europe at all of the spas and places that the wealthy went, and she was stabbed to death by an assassin. His brother, Maximilian, was talked by Napoleon III into disaster. Napoleon III convinced Maximilian to become the Emperor of Mexico in 1863. The Mexicans didn't want him, but he convinced him, and he was put in place by Napoleon III's army. And in 1865, the Mexicans revolt, and Maximilian was shot before a firing squad, executed before a firing squad. Now, if you're wondering where the Monroe Doctrine was, what was happening in the United States in 1863? See, we were tied down with the Civil War at that point. Finally, his son, his only son, Prince Rudolph, died tragically. He had married and made the typical marriage, royal marriage, and later he met and fell wildly in love with a young woman at court. And he wanted to divorce his wife and marry her. Of course, they were Catholic. His father wouldn't hear of it. And he and the girl and an entourage of people went up into the Austrian Alps to a resort called Mayerling. There's a movie by that name, by the way. I knew immediately what it was about. Mayerling. And there was a murder-suicide plot, and he shot her and killed himself. So all of this now in Franz Joseph's family. As a result of the death of his son, Franz Joseph's next heir was his nephew, Francis Ferdinand. And, of course, thereby hangs another tale. On the morning of June the 28th, 1914, in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo, located on the fiercely nationalistic Balkan Peninsula controlled by Austria-Hungary, the single event that was to be the immediate cause of a worldwide war played out. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were there to observe the annual maneuvers of 2 corps of Austrian army stationed in Bosnia. Sophie accompanied her husband because it was their wedding anniversary. She was not an aristocratic marriage, and as a result, her husband thought she was snubbed by the aristocrats at court, and he wanted her with him at this point. It was their anniversary, plus she would be treated with equal dignity by all of the people who were involved in the little ceremony. Now, the parade route that the cars were traveling down had been published in the newspaper, and it was unguarded. There were 7 young Serbian nationalists. Remember now, Serbia was independent. Bosnia was not. So these very idealistic, young, some of them were teenagers, wanted Bosnian independence like Serbia was independent. So there were 7. There were 4 cars in the procession that rolled through the unguarded streets. One of the young men stepped out into the street, threw a bomb at the car. It hit the back of the car and rolled off in the street and exploded. Franz Ferdinand went on to the city hall, wherever they had the welcoming ceremony, went through it, and then requested that his driver take him to the hospital to visit the people who had been injured. Well, the driver somehow got off on the wrong street, took a wrong turn, stopped the car to back up and turn around. When he stopped the car, he put he put the car within 5 feet of Gavrilo Princip, who walked out into the street with a pistol and shot both of them. And both Sophie and Franz Ferdinand were struck. By 11 a.m., the Sarajevo drama was over, and it was just a matter of time from that point on. On July the 5th, an Austrian ambassador bearing a letter from Franz Joseph met with Kaiser William of Germany to secure assurance that Germany would support Austrian invasion of Serbia. They were going to teach Serbia a lesson. But before they did that, they checked with their neighbor and their ally Germany to see if they could get backup. And apparently Kaiser William didn't really understand what was going on. Of course, we in the United States had no idea where Sarajevo was. Never dreamed that we'd be dragged into that situation. But Kaiser William essentially said, go ahead and punish them. And as a result of that, Germany at the end of World War I was blamed for the war, because the rationale was, if Germany had not given Austria-Hungary a blank check to punish Serbia, it all wouldn't have happened. And after he told Austria-Hungary to pretty much do whatever they needed to, William embarked on a North Sea cruise for the next 20 days. Now, at 6 p.m., and this is where Barbara Tuchman is. Time, day, everything is precise. At 6 p.m. on July 23rd, Austrian Ambassador Baron Vladimir Geist carried his country's ultimatum to Serbia's Foreign Secretary. Austria demanded that the Serbian government formally condemn the anti-Austrian propaganda, expel from office anyone who was encouraging it, and accept the collaboration of Austrian agents on Serbian soil in the suppression of such propaganda. Legal action against instigators of the Sarajevo murder plot was demanded, with free entry into Serbia for Austrian officials who would steer the investigation. In other words, they were going to come in and handle everything. That's what they were going to do. Belgrade, which was capital, was given, which was one of the cities, was given only 48 hours in which to comply. I think the capital was there. Sarajevo was not the capital, I don't think. Now, wholly conciliatory in tone, most of what Serbia could honorably concede she did, but she could not agree to Austrians officially waging political warfare against her on her own soil. As to all points Serbia proposed submitting anything that was in contention to the International Tribunal at The Hague. But Serbia knew. They knew what was coming. And their Serbian Minister of Information commented, well, there's nothing to do but die fighting, and you've heard that before. Serbia began to mobilize its forces, convinced that war with Austria-Hungary was inevitable. Rather than look weak, Austria-Hungary, having provoked war with the backing of Germany, called for mobilization. At 11 a.m. on July 28th, 1 month, almost to the minute after the Sarajevo murders, Austria-Hungary notified Serbia by telegram that she had declared war. Germany had not been notified. They didn't feel that they had to notify Germany. News of the Austrian declaration of war against Serbia reached St. Petersburg, Russia, late on the afternoon of July 28th. When informed by Foreign Minister Sazonov, Tsar Nicholas II telegraphed his cousin William, and this is the telegram, the quote, "An ignoble war has been declared to a weak country. The indignation of Russia, fully shared by me, is enormous. I foresee very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure brought upon me and forced to take extreme measures that will lead to war." Now, in these exchanges back and forth, they addressed each other as Dear Willie and Dear Nicky. They were first cousins, and so was the King of England. And as a result, in history, they're known as the Willie-Nicky letters. But he was telling Kaiser William the truth. Russia was the greatest of the Slavic nations, and it felt it was there to protect the other weaker Slavic nations, and it called itself the protector of the Slavs. So Nicholas was right. Now, you remember probably something about Tsar Nicholas. Remember a movie, Nicholas and Alexandra, that was popular a few years back from a book? Tsar Nicholas had come to the throne of Russia in 1894. His grandfather was Alexander II, and Russia still had serfdom. That had died out in Western Europe in the Middle Ages. And Alexander II was a liberal czar. He tried to move Russia into the modern age. He ended serfdom. He allowed some form of representative government on a local level. He put all of the court proceedings in public rather than in secret. And of course, when a reformer does that in a country, he makes both sides mad. Some people think he didn't do enough, and other people think he did too much. So when he was riding in a carriage down the streets, a terrorist group threw a bomb into his carriage, and he was severely wounded. I think his legs were almost completely blown off. They took him back to the palace in St. Petersburg to die. And while he was dying, his son and his grandson were with him. And Nicholas II never forgot it. You know, you do nice things for the people and look what happens, you know. And he and his father and then he reversed all of Alexander II's policies. They censored the press, they controlled the church, they controlled education, they imprisoned or exiled or executed anybody who spoke out against the government. So he pushed Russia backward rather than forward into the modern age. Now, he had personal problems. He and his wife, Alexandra, had 4 beautiful daughters, and the youngest child, the 5th, was a son, the only heir, Alexei. But he was afflicted with hemophilia. And the Tsarina was very, she was so religious, she was almost mystic. And out of nowhere appeared on the scene in St. Petersburg this self-styled monk with horrible morals and filthy Rasputin. And by some way, he could stop the bleeding for this child. Historians speculate whether he could hypnotize him, whether he could simply calm him down, probably got his mother out of the room. And she thought he was sent by God to save her child, and she would hear nothing against him. And he had tremendous influence, which was all negative. It turned out badly. But that's another whole fascinating story for another time. But all of this was going on in Nicholas's personal life. On July the 30th, Sazonov told Nicholas there was no longer any choice. Russia must have full mobilization. And this is what Nicholas said, and I thought this showed that he was a man who felt for others. Think of what awful responsibility you're advising me to take. Think of the thousands and thousands of men who will be sent to their deaths. And for more than an hour, he refused to sign the document, but he finally signed it. Austria-Hungary ordered full mobilization the next day, July the 31st, at 12:28 p.m. Later the same day, Germany mobilized. The German ambassador in Paris told the French premier, Viviani, the president was Poincaré, that France had 18 hours to say whether or not she would remain neutral if Germany fought Russia. At 4 o'clock on August the 1st, 1914, the first poster appeared in Paris announcing French mobilization. Germany's mobilization order followed France's by less than an hour. 2 days later, Germany declared war against France. The Kaiser declared that the troops would be home before the leaves fell from the trees. And that's another thing I've learned in studying. I've studied an awful lot of wars. So many times when the war begins, the leaders who have a hand in starting these wars indicate that they are not going to be very lengthy. And as we know, that's often not the case. I remember when we invaded Afghanistan, I had taught about Afghanistan for years. Nobody who invades Afghanistan comes out very well. The British, when they owned a quarter of the globe, did it twice in the 1800s and had to withdraw. How many years have we been there? 17? So often, these wars are much longer than people anticipate. England's foreign policy was always grounded. Now, England, of course, is in this alliance. France is in the war, Russia's in the war, England's in the alliance. England's foreign policy was always balance of power, and it was that way in World War II. England was dedicated to making sure that no single country controlled most of Europe. And the other part of England's foreign policy was the Navy. The Channel was going to be English territory for the English Navy, is what it amounted to. And as a result, Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, had stated, if Germany dominated the continent, it would be disagreeable to us as well as to others, for we should be isolated. And that's what happened in World War II. They were isolated until we came in. Also, England waited to see if Germany would invade France by marching through Belgium. Now, Belgium had been declared neutral territory in 1839, shortly after Belgium gained independence from the Dutch. The Dutch were more German, and they were Protestant. Belgium was more French, and it was Catholic, and they got their independence. The great powers of Europe had signed a pledge defending Belgian neutrality if Belgium would simply refuse to enter into any war. Now, all these powerful nations agreed not to attack Belgium. That was it. Sign the document. However, Germany's plan of attack was a quick knockout blow to France. So then they could wipe out France and then turn on Russia. That was the plan. Somewhat like Hitler planned in World War II. Few differences there. The fastest route to France was through Belgium. Belgium was flat territory. It was perfect to march through. And that was the question that Britain wanted to know. Was Germany going to invade France through Belgium? On August the 2nd, Germany delivered an ultimatum to Belgium, demanding free passage of the German army through Belgian territory. King Albert of Belgium was given 12 hours to respond. And he comes out of this situation as a hero, because this little country didn't have much of a chance of standing up against Germany's army. But he simply was not going to let somebody just invade his country and not put up a struggle. So he prepared to fight. And some historians say that that really had an effect on the war, that the Belgian resistance gave France more time to get ready and get their troops up to the front for the Battle of the Marne to prevent the Germans from invading France. But he fought. The British protested, insisting that Belgian neutrality be preserved. The German foreign minister replied, surely, that Britain wouldn't go to war over the treaty with Belgium. He called it a mere scrap of paper. That's what his word was worth, a mere scrap of paper. The Germans marched into Belgium on August the 4th, 1914. The British sent an ultimatum to Germany that Britain would go to war at midnight if the invasion of Belgium was not halted. Within 6 weeks after the assassination at Sarajevo, the major nations of Europe were at war. Sir Edward Grey, and I thought about you, the gentle bird watcher, that's what Barbara Tuchman called him, who was Foreign Secretary of Britain, had reluctantly but firmly made the case to Parliament for Britain's entry into war. Sadly, he stated, the lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. And that was the beginning. Does anybody have any questions? It's a minute or two.
Francis, I want to ask you not about this exactly, but you're a former history. Why is our country backed off in so much history of world history? You go home and ask some of your children, teenagers in particular, who our allies were in World War II, they won't know. And you ask some of the old ones who a guy like Stephen Foster was, they've never heard of it. So why have we, and I notice now we're not even going to have history in our tests in the state.
I remember when I was teaching, we used to have Industry Day. And we teachers would go through industries, and the leaders of the industries would come to the school and make speeches to us. And I thought it was fascinating. I enjoyed it. But invariably, they would get up and say, in order to preserve our wonderful capitalistic system, we need to emphasize math and science and English. And I tell my students, and this was in the old auditorium, I tell my students, often I had the urge to stand up and say, and in what class do you think capitalism is taught? It's not taught in English, math, and science. It's not valued. It's not valued by our society. That's unfortunate, but it's not. You know, David McCullough went to Congress a few years ago and made that case to Congress that the study of history was so vital. But yes?
Comment little bit on Barbara Tuchman, and I had the impression that she was sort of our first great woman historian and served as an inspiration for your generation. And what is her place?
I'm sure she is among the first. She published this book in 1962, and that was really, in a sense, the beginning of the modern woman's movement. It started back with the vote, back in the period of World War I. But I remember there were a few others. You remember William and, was it an Ariel Durant? Was it William Durant? But his wife, Ariel, also was on the list of authors. She shared with him the credit for writing the book. So I know she was one of the first. I couldn't really say if she was the first, but I'm sure she was one of them. Anybody else? I hope you could hear me.
Thank you.
My voice is so soft.
Coming in. Then it has tickets there. Do you want to join us?